and just kind of share thoughts. I think about three questions when I think about when I'm working to both lead and collaborate and create an environment that has both leadership and collaboration across it. What's the nature of the work? What's the value that we're creating and for whom? Betray myself as a social worker. That's a very social worky kind of tool to always add for whom or to whom or from whom on all the, you gotta include the people. But we'll talk a little bit more about that question there. And then talking about roles and what roles do I and others play and how do we understand ourselves in the work that we're doing. For each of these, I'll follow kind of a similar format. I'll share a tool or a framework that I use when I'm wrestling with this question in a particular context, and give some examples about and information about that tool and framework, and then we can have a conversation about it from there. So we'll work through these three questions with a tool for each. Anything else before I jump into the first question? All right. The nature of the work. This has become one of my favorite tools that I learned more recently in the last year and a half or so. It's a Welsh word, cynefin, that means habitat. Dave Snowden originally proposed it. It's become a big part of adaptive leadership approaches. And the idea is that you've got these four quadrants that represent types of problems. So a problem can be simple, complicated, chaotic, or complex, or a situation or a context. Doesn't necessarily problem, maybe is one way to describe the word there. And depending on which of the quadrants you're in, you use a different practice to work towards solutions. And the words that you see there represent they're prioritized. You prioritize different things towards solving those problems. So with a complex problem, you probe what's going on with the problem, sense what's happening with in the environment, and then work to build responses. Versus with a chaotic problem, you need to act immediately to stabilize the chaos, then sense what's going on in the environment and the chaos and gather more information about the problem and the potential solutions, and then have a broader response. Versus a simple problem where you need to sense and gather the details of exactly what's going on, organize, categorize the possible solutions, and then develop a response. And complicated problems, you sense and analyze, so it's a little more complicated than the simple problems, but still sort of involves developing from good practice how to respond in a organized, clear fashion. There's the word I was looking for. I found this framework really helpful because you come into a situation, you usually don't have a set of problems or a problem space, as I saw in one of the bullets on the whiteboard that we started with, a problem space that has just one of these. So you may have aspects of what's going on in what you're trying to solve for or the value you're trying to create that are complex, that are chaotic, that are simple, that are complicated. And that can be really helpful because as you're trying to decide what to do and decide how to do it, you can use this framework to sort of go, oh, well, my simple problems I solve for differently than my complicated, my complex, or my chaotic problems. The space in the middle disorder simply means these are the spaces where we have not yet been able to really get clarity on what's going on here. So our ability to clarify the problem space is still in disorder. Questions about the framework before I jump into an example?
What's the difference between a complex and a complicated problem?
Good question. I think the chaotic one always feels like the most obvious, like, duh, there's chaos and things are a hot mess. A complicated problem I like to think of as a multi-stepped, multi-layered, simple problem. There's a clear right answer or a clear definition of success. Like, it just is a lot of steps. It's just difficult to do. Not always exactly, it's clear what needs to happen, but not clear how to make it happen. And that's the complicated part. Versus in a complex situation, usually there, we may not even be clear on what success would look like in this environment. So in a complex problem, you both have complexity, but also an inability to know for sure what success would look like, to know for sure what tools should be used to address the situation, et cetera.
That helps.
Yeah, thank you. I think the example that I was going to use may help. So this is I thought of a situation that I had kind of all of these in it. I was responsible for, in a consulting project, the human capital side, handling all the people and processy-oriented stuff of launching a new vendor invoice tool. So the client was rolling out a new tool to allow vendors to access their invoices digitally. And there were a variety of problems with all of the things going on from a people side that needed to be addressed. So we had, the technology was in place, it was getting close to go live. And I picked 4 different problems here to sort of illustrate the difference between these. We had a chaotic problem in the sense that our stakeholders were a bit of a hot mess. The different stakeholders some of the stakeholders didn't even understand what we were launching. Some of them had very disparate perspectives on what needed to be done or how ready we were for this to be launched. There were a couple of different call centers that the client side had that handled users' needs, handled user issues, and depending on which user group they're in, they might call a different call center. So we had to coordinate across all these different stakeholders. And when I started on the project, it was a hot mess. No one had actually even defined who all the stakeholders were. And they were all aware that this was happening. Some of them were quite upset. Some of them were entirely indifferent, and all of them needed some clarity on both what was going on and what we expected of them and how to help make this a successful launch. So it was a chaotic problem where the first thing I needed to do was just get a hold of all of these people and understand who they were, immediately had to act to help some of them calm down and some of them realize that this was happening and they needed to get on board, et cetera. And then as I started to get clarity on a sense of what was happening and understanding each of the stakeholders' needs, was able to respond long-term with the problem really became more simple and complicated in a lot of ways, and was able to respond with a stakeholder plan and other things that helped us work across all these stakeholders in a more organized fashion and change the chaotic problem to a not chaotic problem that was more manageable. Compare that to, we need a user manual. There was no kind of just overview user manual of how this new system worked for either the call centers or for the users. That's a pretty simple problem. It took a while, it was 40, 50, 60 pages, but you can build a pretty good user manual. There's lots of examples out there of what a good one looks like, and you just needed to go through and take the system that we had built and make sure we had all of it documented as far as how to use the thing in the way that one builds a modern user manual. So it was a clear right answer. Someone just needed to sit down, that was me, and do the 30 hours of work or so to just build the user manual. And I roped in a couple other people to help, and we just did it. There was nothing more than just writing the user manual that needed to happen, sharing it out with people, going from there. A more complicated problem in this situation was that there were a whole bunch of other questions that had already existed and then arose as we were addressing the stakeholders' issues of what other training or support needs there might be. Should we have webinars? Should we have videos of how to use the system? Should we, would there be other support needs for some of the vendors that weren't ready to go digital in accessing their invoices, et cetera? Did we need to have more guidance for the call centers? There are a whole lot of questions of exactly how deep we got in what we offered in training and support needs. And there's a whole bunch of potential tools. There were clear right answers and what needed, but that took a little more analysis. So I had to gather the information about what different people thought about the needs and why they thought it, and analyze all of the information about potential training and support needs, and then respond with a plan of, here's the things we're gonna do, here's the things we're not gonna do, and why. And work with that across the stakeholders that were no longer quite as chaotic to help them understand the plan for the rest of the training and support needs. That gets us through chaotic, simple, and complicated. I would say the most complex problem that we had to solve was, how would we handle hypercare after go live? So we were going to launch this product. There were still plenty of unknowns of how many calls would we get? What problems would we see? You don't know what you don't know. And so we wanted to make sure we had a plan in place that would be able to be quickly adaptive and responsive. And so we had people posted at both of the call centers, had a person from my team, a person from the tech team, at each of the call centers ready to work with the folks that were taking calls. So we could jump in on a call as needed. We could just kind of gather with them once every hour or two and sort of hear how things were going on the calls they were able to handle themselves. And then we were able to work directly with the team back at the main office that was handling all of any issues that came up, to make sure that any production issues got addressed, to help the call center understand what user confusion we were seeing, et cetera. So that was a complex problem because we had to kind of probe exactly what the needs might be and probe where would be a good place for us to be. And then we had to sense what was happening as the problem continued to evolve during go live and shortly after go live. And then the response kind of developed on an ongoing basis. And what success looked like changed depending on what problems were coming through. There were a couple of days in hypercare where there's nothing, it was fine. We're just only getting a few calls an hour. And there were a couple of times where we stumbled on some really significant production bug, and had to fix it. Or stumbled on a one user whose data had gotten messed up was another example. It was like, that wasn't a big issue for many users, but it was a big issue for that user and we needed to solve it. I'll stop there. That's my example. Other questions about the framework before I jump into a couple of other tips about using this tool as a collaborative in a collaborative leadership style? All right. So these are a couple of questions that I work to think about when I'm using this tool. In order to be more collaborative and still offer leadership, I think it's helpful to ask myself, who gets to decide which problems we're focusing on and how we define them. So if this was just me and the executive sponsor of the project on the client side and the partner on the project or whomever, that's not a very collaborative way to define the set of problems that need to be solved for the people and process side of this go live. And so it's important for us to do some probing at the call centers with some of the leaders of the different units that worked with a lot of vendors. So we specifically reached out to some of the folks that had a large number of vendors that they worked with. So the units that we looked and said, which units have the most vendors, that different number of vendors that they sell to. And then we reached out to those vendors or those unit heads or whoever's in charge of procurement for that unit to get their perspective on launching the system, since they would have a lot of information because they had a lot of vendors. And we also talked to some vendors as well to help make sure we understood just the overall set of problems that might get defined or prioritized to get dealt with. I also think it was important to sort of get input on which quadrant the problem belongs in from a variety of people. Because depending on who you talk to, a problem may seem simple to one person, but very chaotic to another person. So in this case, to give an example, the tech lead from our consulting firm at that time didn't think the stakeholders was a big problem at all. I was a little suspicious of that and started asking questions and exploring stakeholders a little bit more and found out that there were a lot of stakeholder concerns that needed to get addressed. So what seemed like to him a complicated or simple problem, as I asked other people, hey, what's up with our stakeholder map? Who needs to be involved in these decisions? Who needs to let us know what the needs are here? Quickly became clear that there was a lot we could look at in terms of, and that really was a chaotic problem. And then similarly in the solutioning. So for me, it was really important to involve the call center folks in looking at some of the collateral they were producing, the user manual, the hypercare plan, and make sure that they agreed with the solution since they would be part of implementing it. And similarly, as far as defining success, that needed to be defined not only by the various project leaders on our side, the consulting side and the client side, but also I was curious what success from a vendor's perspective, what success from the call center's perspective, and what success from our tech teams, individual engineers' perspective as far as what hypercare looks like. I'm going to pause for a second. If there's nothing, I'm going to jump to the next slide. So also throw one bonus tool in here, and that's called visual interpretation. So this is when I have, particularly when I have a very sort of structured framework that I'm using like this, I often find it useful to, in attempting to use the framework, to find something completely almost the opposite of it to help facilitate the discussion. So in using this tool, it can be very useful to throw up a picture like this. And the beauty of visual interpretation, or there's different names for this activity, is that you can pick any picture that seems interesting to you and it'll work. And the idea is you throw this picture up because, hey, it's an interesting picture. It's a great mural in Southwest Detroit by Elton Duran, who's a fantastic Detroit muralist. And then ask people questions about the very concrete thing you're trying to do, which is get your problems defined into quadrants so that you know how to approach them. So I might say, hey guys, we're gonna we've got 8 problems, we need to prioritize them and get them into these quadrants. And then I might throw up this picture and say, so looking at those 8 problems, talk to me about who can help make sure we're solving the right problems using the picture. So use a visual reference because it gets people thinking outside just the words on the page or even the 4 quadrants that we're talking about, and can actually, from a neuroscience perspective, trigger parts of their brain that they wouldn't be activated just by looking at the list of 8 problems or these 4 quadrants or all the stuff I just babbled about the quadrants. Instead, they're going, oh, what's the man with the apple have to do with our problems? Like, who are all those other people? What's up with the banners in the background? Like, it's a church, right? Huh. What does any of this have to do with our problems? I don't know, but I'm now thinking a million other things besides list of 8 bullets and 4 quadrants, and sort of intentionally short circuits the brain a little bit to encourage creative thinking. And these are some examples of questions I might ask a team as we're working to define and prioritize our problems relative to a situation using a picture like this. That's one of the tools that I like to use for helping define the work and the problems we're trying to solve and the approach we're going to take to them in that work. Questions, comments, other discussion points we want to address?
Like, this is just a comment. I really like the visual description piece that you talked about and showed. I've seen that work and I've used it in the past, and it really does get people out of the box to start thinking about different things, right? We use it's kind of a weird analogy. Use your right side of your brain my past employer. So, and just about being creative, and it works. It just state it or show something that gets somebody thinking that way. So thanks for sharing.
Yeah, you're welcome. And I'd agree. I tend to be a very structured, organized, left brain kind of thinker. But I do find it really helpful. Like I said, I almost find it helpful to mix the two. So go, oh, if I'm trying to categorize things into 4 quadrants, something that gets me more creative and open thinking is really helpful. I've seen people do it with popsicle sticks that have random words, and you do random word association with it. Any of that kind of stuff can just get your brain in goofy mode a little bit.
And get the involvement you're looking for.
You can also use body motion for it. So ask people to position themselves somewhere in the room can be really helpful. Ask people to use their body language to represent something about the problem can be really helpful as well. Other thoughts on defining the work as a collaborative leader before we jump on to the next question? All right. So for me, I think when thinking about being a collaborative leader, this one in some ways has been one of the most important. And I have yet to find a framework for answering the question, what value are you creating for whom, that I'm in love with. So I have my own that I create. This is one I like to use simple tables. I've had times where this table becomes much more complex than this, depending on the situation. So these can be stakeholder maps, customer groups, but for me, the goal is to in some way categorize the people involved and get clear, not about value as a abstract idea in some sense, or as something that we just talk about on its own, but value very specifically related to people. Often find that you can include your own team as one of the groups in value creation. So if you're not creating value for your own team, you're probably, that's a question to address at least. But also then who are all the other customers you're working to serve, other stakeholders, who are groups that are impacted by this, even if they're not customers or direct stakeholders in some way. And so, as I said, this table you can adapt in a lot of different ways, add different rows, find different ways to define the groups. For me, the most important part is defining a manageable set of groups. So you need to have something that rationalizes the group of humans involved. So if you've got 27 groups, that's not it. Also, if you have 2 groups, that's probably not it. I would guess for most work worth doing, you're going to have 3, 4, 5, but probably less than 10 groups that you can rationalize the impacted humans in a way that helps you understand, hey, this approximately tells us who we're working to create value for with whatever it is we're doing. This is probably the simplest version of it that I use. What are each of those groups' needs relative to the work we're doing? What are the benefits that our work will deliver to them? And how are we going to measure that? I think it's really important to have some way to validate with people from that group that your understanding of needs is accurate and that the benefits really be valuable to them. So actually finding some folks from that group and saying, hey, are we understanding you correctly? And if we delivered these benefits, would that really be meaningful to you? And would it help with the needs that we understand? And that particularly matters because your metrics should then be able to directly measure that you've delivered the benefits towards the needs for the group of people. If the metrics, so this table is meant to be aligned all the way up and down the column. I also think, as you'll see in the example that I have here, ideally you have a set of success metrics that can kind of be used in multiple places on the table. It both makes your life easier, but it also kind of, for me, is a measure that you both have a rational set of, that you've defined the right set of groups, because probably if a metric can only be used for one group, something's missing in the way you've defined your group or in the way you've defined your set of metrics. And I would also point out, for me, this is a great place to consider justice and equity questions in the way that you've defined your groups. Who are you leaving out? Who are you prioritizing? What role is power playing in the way that the groups have been defined or the way that the groups will get served, so that the needs and benefits will be addressed. So this table can really, doing this kind of definition work, can help expose that and open that conversation about if the groups you're serving and the needs and benefits are being addressed in a just and equitable way. This is a relatively simple example, but I think at least gives some meat to kind of understand how I might use this. So referring back to a similar type of example, I also had a project where we launched a new employee portal for an organization. This was pretty similar to what we used, or some of what we used. Our table was quite a bit more complex than this, but this is a boil up of what we used, which was roughly they had a whole lot of digitally savvy staff, people that were just going to celebrate this new employee portal and be really excited that they could just go online and look at their pay stubs or look at their HR benefits information. And this effectively matched their expectations for their life in general. There are also folks that might have, they had a group of staff that had limited access, and that was both folks that just in general had limited access to internet or limited knowledge of how to use this new employee portal, and also some folks that didn't have the ability to access the information while they were on the clock, which was a legal problem for the client because they couldn't require the employees to have to access this at home. They could allow their employees to access this at home, but they needed to be able to access it in work. And some of the folks worked in a building where they couldn't get cell phone access, and there weren't computers available to them. And so we had to be able to solve for this limited access group being able to use this new employee portal. The client also had a lot of transient workers, so gig workers or folks, part-time workers that just came and went over time. And then we also considered our call center here as well, as far as who was going to be handling all of the calls for the new employee portal, and would they be able to serve all of the users very well as we launched the portal. And then for each of those groups, you can see there we defined their set of needs, and then the benefits that we would work to deliver to them and how we would measure if that actually happened as we launched the portal. So the digitally savvy staff, the idea was just, can they get all their info anywhere, any device, quick and easy? We were measuring number of clicks to get to the last page they viewed. So if it took them 2 clicks, that was better than if it took them 7 clicks before they reached their desired page. And then also just the number of content page views. So how often were folks just looking at the content on the site was a metric of success for folks that would be using the page to view valuable content to them. Similarly, for the limited access group, we were interested in, were they able to get to the content that they needed? Because these folks also had limited access, there were kiosks already set up and able to print information. So we made sure that they would be able, as they were getting on or off the clock before they entered spaces that didn't have mobile access and where they couldn't have computer access, to use a kiosk to log in and to print their stuff and take it with them. And not force them to ask to access the line. So we're curious, how much would we see those documents exported and printed or emailed to themselves? And then with the transient workers, one of the issues was that folks would come and go from the system, and we wanted to keep them associated with the same employee ID and social security number was used to do that in a secure system, that social security number and EID were only linked in a way that the user could view them through password access. And we also used two-factor authentication. And that allowed, as folks came and went, for them to come back to the same EID when they recreated the account as a transient worker came or went. They would pop back into the same EID that they had been using before. And then one of the big advantages was this introduced self-service password reset. So we were looking at how much did we see a decrease in the total number of calls and the total number of password resets at the call center. A couple of questions that I like to ask when I'm working with teams using a table like this, and these are for me are especially important. If you're creating a table like this, something I like to share more broadly than just my delivery, like the folks that are going to work directly with the table. So I want to validate this with various leaders across the project, with folks from each of these groups, and make sure this is something that makes sense to folks that are seeing this project from the work that we're doing from a variety of perspectives. And I also like to think about, if this is the right set of stakeholder groups, are we able to serve them? And if not, what are we going to do about that? Similarly, like, what makes us confident that we can deliver across the set of needs and benefits, and what risks do we see to delivering to these needs and benefits? And then lastly, I think it's really important to identify who's going to really take ownership over what the ongoing tracking and addressing any issues with any particular stakeholder group or a metric. And I've seen it work really well both ways when you use this kind of framework to define the value that you're delivering. You can kind of assign ownership of a stakeholder group, or you can define ownership of a metric, and then when your metric changes, you have to figure out which stakeholder groups that involves, depending on the table that you end up with and the framework that you're using. But assigning ownership one way or another, it both allows people to jump in and own something that they're passionate about, and also to be able to, excuse me, be able to have clarity on what they're responsible for. Questions about this tool before I jump to the bonus part of the question number 2? As I was thinking about what else I would throw into value creation, personas, and use cases, the previous table is not, the groups could be considered personas, but is not as use case oriented. And even this was the best picture I could find of a persona use case, but still doesn't quite feel like a full use case to me. The one thing I was going to mention that I find really helpful in using personas plus use cases for value creation definition, if you think of personas as the actors and use cases as the scenes. So personas tells you like, oh yeah, I can really imagine what those kinds of customers or users would look like. I can tell who Jane or Juan or Alfred is or whatever. These make sense to me as the actors and the scenes are, yeah, I could really see how that's going to play out. I also like to think of a use case as, if you give me the use case, I could walk through and do the user flow with that use case. You've given me enough information to play the role in the scene as that person. I think that's important to always use them together. Because if you just have a persona, you're not really clearly saying what your expectations are of how that persona might use the system that you're creating. And if you just have a use case, it's not always exactly clear who that use case is. And so combining them allows it to both really make the system personal and who you're seeking to serve, but also make it clear what you're seeking to serve in that person's process. I always think it's better to err on being overly specific because it's easier to then generalize in how the system approaches that set of problems than to have a use case or a persona that is too generic that doesn't really guide you in development. And then the same thing, you can use the same kind of guidance as with the table to make sure you've got a cohesive set. Questions, comments, or thoughts before we jump forward to the next section?
Hey, really quick here, stakeholder matrix. One thing I would add to mine, which I thought was really helpful, was the stakeholder group's attitude over time. So if they started out as super resistant to the project, and then we gave them some benefits they liked, and then all of a sudden they improved, we'd go on a tell a friend campaign with that stakeholder group.
There's I'm forgetting the name of it right now, but there's a framework that I really like to use for that you can map people based on their ability to cause the project to fail or succeed, and their investment in the project. So someone that doesn't really give a shit about your project, but also can't really impact whether it succeeds or not is not very important to you, and vice versa. And then there are folks that have massive ability to impact it, but are not very invested. And it's a really helpful set of quadrants. And we would often add that as a row, where we would have their, I forget it, it's change something or other framework, but where they sit relative to whatever it is you're doing. And we would map where they were, and that would help us know how to engage them. And you could see it change over time. So if there were people you needed to move to higher levels of investment or make them have a higher or lower impact on the success of the project, you could aim to influence that as well. So 100% agree, Jim. Other things before we move forward? So I think one of the things that I love most about seeking to approach things in a collaborative leadership way is bringing a personal aspect to it, but not just for the sake of being personal, but because I believe that we are people in the work, and knowing myself and understanding other people makes us all more effective. There's a lot of different tools for this, as I'll point out at the end. I'm going to share one that I used a lot at a previous firm. Jeff, don't kill me. This is Deloitte's business chemistry framework. It's based on a whole lot of data that they've gathered. It also is loosely associated or based on several other frameworks. I have a list of them on the last slide of this section. It also looks a lot like another system called Compass Points, or the personality compass, sorry. I like it because it's really simple. So if you look at some of the other examples, it's really hard to remember all of the different persona types or strengths or et cetera, et cetera. But it's really easy to remember 4 things. Pioneers, drivers, guardians, or integrators. These are 4 directional approaches or directional attitudes about work. So folks that take a more pioneering approach to work are all this list of things you see here. Drivers, the same thing. Guardians, we've got a list for each of them here. They have a couple of subtypes in drivers and integrators. And they have a free test online. You can go and get a hunch of a rough sense of yourself. They make you pay for the full thing. I find it really useful to use this more. You can use the personality compass, which maps roughly to the same thing here. And then Deloitte has a bunch of different stuff about this. I find this as a framework really helpful because I can very quickly see where someone else is falling on this. Are they tending more to seem like a guardian where they are methodical and very oriented towards data and evidence and move slowly? Or are they a driver that's really focused on getting things done, organizing the work and making it happen, or a pioneer? And kind of understand the approach that a person is bringing to work. And also understand, especially everyone kind of falls somewhere within a matrix here. So maybe they're a pioneer that has a lot of drivery and integratory traits, or maybe they're just way out here and heavily pioneer oriented. So getting a sense of where someone falls. But it does seem like from when I worked for Deloitte previous to Integral, that it is pretty accurate as far as people tending. Very seldom do you see people purely being in the middle. They're somewhere in this ring out here. And so it's a helpful way to kind of type the way that people approach work. To give an example, this was pretty consistent has been pretty consistent over the years. I'm 49% driver, very heavily focused on making things happen, getting things done, moving things forward, organizing, but also 47% pioneer. So I would sit kind of right up here, and a lot less focused on anything related to keeping the status quo, organizing all the data, supporting everything with clear, strong evidence, maintaining stability, and less interested in terms of exactly the work environment that's created and how all the relationships play out and what the emotional atmosphere is like. Those are things I prioritize less. This was really helpful to me when I was exposed to it because it made me realize, gosh, these are really low percentages. So I'm actually a little bit of an outlier in the sense that, as I said here, most people tend to be somewhere in this ring, and they tend to really kind of be somewhere in where these squares are, basically. They may have some traits of one or the other, but they fall right into one of them. And I sit out in the middle between two, but pretty far out. So it's really helpful understanding my own approach to work, and that most people tended to be one or the other, and I was very much in the middle between pioneer and driver, but had none of these other two, both of which were unique characteristics. It also helped me in one of the situations where we used this very heavily. I was working with a client that almost everyone in the group had at least a strong percentage of integrator, and a lot of them were just solid integrators. So there's a lot of value that I could offer them because I was different than they were, but also created some tension between myself and the client at times. And it was also helpful for them because they really didn't have any drivers on the team. And so that was one of the most valuable things I offered them, was keeping things moving along because they had the other traits at least present. So this can kind of help you define, you need all of these traits to make valuable work happen. And so for me, it made me realize, well, they were able to take care of a lot of these other aspects, and I needed to trust them and look to them for that. But then there were unique things I could offer that they didn't have. And we all needed to be able to talk about the tension that the differences between us might create. Whatever frame you pick, whether it's this one or there's a bunch of them on the next slide that I'll share, I always like to just use these regularly to ask my team, like, how does this help us understand each other better? How can you use this to navigate the work and navigate conflict in it? It's also helpful just to have casual conversations with teammates about, oh, what surprises you, me, us about you, me, our types, etc. And what does our team makeup tell us? I intentionally didn't use AccuMax, which is what Integral uses, because I'm less familiar with it. Integral is the first place I've gotten to use this framework, which is also really strong. And we actually talk about all of these questions when we first start a project with the team, to help us think about our individual AccuMax makeup and how we understand ourselves, and also the overall team makeup in the AccuMax framework. So it'd be really helpful for driving team discussions of each individual person's value, and also overall your team dynamics as individual people with your own personalities and approaches to who you are and how you function. If you're interested in this kind of stuff, these are a bunch of other tools that I found really useful. Personality Compass looks a lot like the business chemistry framework. There's a lot less resources for it. It's older. And so there are not as many highly developed resources or data for it. Versus if you go out, Deloitte has made a lot of stuff available as far as insights from the business chemistry framework, but those are Personality Compass and business chemistry basically represent the same ideas in a framework. Enneagram and Myers-Briggs come out of social science, but they can definitely still be used, and they're more like oriented towards personal relationships, but can definitely still be used to understand people in their work environment. They each have different strengths and weaknesses to them as far as when or where they're useful or not useful. I find Enneagram to be a little easier to understand because there's just less types. But Myers-Briggs, I think in some ways is easier for some folks because you've got clear dichotomies for each of the 4 letters that they use. And then Belbin team roles, and if you're a strengths finder, then are similar. As another framework that I've seen used and used myself and really liked, that identifies strengths that people bring to and roles that they play within a team to serve the team and to serve the work. And then DISC is a similar kind of 4-point approach to where you identify a primary and or a secondary characteristic that you bring to how you do work.